So I'm Kim Cook. I'm a professor of sociology and criminology at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And I am also the director of the Restorative Justice Collaborative. So I believe in restoration, I believe in transformation from truth telling, acknowledgement, repair, and moving forward of the more healed society. I grew up in New England. I have deep, deep, deep New England roots. My colonial ancestors arrived in 1620, and shortly thereafter, 1621, 1626, all of the ships that started coming over in the 1620s had my ancestors on them. I never knew that my ancestors enslaved people until a few years back. I was working on my genealogy and I discovered in the probate records for my 8 times great-grandfather, Samuel Edson, in colonial Massachusetts. I was reading his will. And in his will, which I have here on my phone, that I bequeathed to my daughter Susanna, after my wife's decease, my Negro slave Sarah. And then later on in his will, he bequeaths to his son, who is my 7 times great-grandfather, his Negro slave George. And I had never seen anything like that in my ancestry before, and I was shocked. So after I got over the nausea in my stomach, after reading that for the first time, I was angry. I was disgusted. And then a deep, deep, deep sense of resolve came over me that this is personal. I had been an anti-racist activist for a long time. Back in the 80s, I was part of the Shantytown protests against the apartheid in South Africa when I was in college. And so protesting against the injustices of systemic and global racism has been a part of my life's journey for a very long time. So reading the will made it more personal. And so what I realized was that I have not what some people assume is a sense of guilt, but what I know to be a determination and a lifetime responsibility to undo the damage, to dismantle the system of white supremacy that my ancestors created. I later discovered that my ancestors, in passing the first law in the colonial Massachusetts legislature, if you can call it that, was the Body of Liberties in 1641, which was the first law in the country, well, in the colonies, that established lifetime enslavement for African people in the colonies. And when I discovered that, it was another moment of a sense of determination that it's my responsibility as a person who is a descendant of the people who did that to undo it in any way that I can, in every way that I can, as long as I can, as long as I live. There's no way I can't do this work. I have a moral obligation to do this work. So I think the way I interpret that is I now live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I am a co-facilitator of a chapter of Coming to the Table, which is a racial reconciliation group. And I'm working very closely with the descendants of the 1898 massacre and coup d'etat because they're beautiful people and I love them. And because I can and I have, I think, a capacity to be welcoming, kind, compassionate, and generous as best I can. I'm also sometimes sassy and short-tempered, but that's a different story. And so what I'm doing as a professor and as a co-facilitator of Coming to the Table is I work with the group of descendants to organize and establish events for the commemoration. And I'm also working with the descendants to help advocate for reparations. And as a professor, I'm also doing research on collecting in-depth interviews and life history interviews with descendants about the 1898 massacre and coup d'etat, to collect the stories, the family impacts across the generations. And then those stories will be part of an archive at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, for future generations. I believe in, as I learned in restorative justice, the Lakota tradition of the principle of the seventh generation, which is the choices we make today will impact our descendants 7 generations from now. And we want them to be good impacts. We want them to be impacts for the better. And when we look at what 7 generations ago our ancestors did, and in my case, my 5 times great-grandparents were deeply invested and deeply participating in the genocide of Native Americans in New England, that's hard, and that's still impacting us today. 2.5 million Native Americans were enslaved during the colonial period as well. And that is something that we also don't talk enough about as a society for telling the truth. So I think it's important for us to speak the truth, research the truth, use our family stories as a fuel and an inspiration for continuing to do this work. Not to be the white saviors, goodness no, because there's nothing about that would be appropriate, but to be allies in the process of excavating the truth and making the truth matter for the greater good of moving forward with a better society. So that's why I do what I do.